Well, let's start off with the World Trade Organization. The organization's chief, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has expressed cautious optimism on the outcome of the trade ministers' meeting in Geneva. Now, the WTO chief envisions one or two global deals this week, but also warns that the path there will be bumpy and rocky. The Director General from Nigeria says the world has become more complicated since the WTO's last ministerial conference nearly 5 years ago. Now, Okonjo-Iweala listed the lingering COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Ukraine crisis and the major food and energy crisis as the leading pieces of a poly-crisis.
The world has changed since the last one. I wish I could say for better. But it's certainly become more complicated. I've never seen in my lifetime so many conflicts at the same time. And I've spoken so much about this because it's pretty unusual. We're still trying to cope with a pandemic that has cost the world millions of lives. We have an international security crisis with the war in Ukraine. We have a major food crisis, an energy crisis. And we have an ongoing climate change crisis. So this poly-crisis or simultaneous crisis is really unprecedented.
Well, let's now get an update on the meeting from John Bever. He joins us now in Geneva. Great to have you with us on the show, John. Now, of course, as you heard the WTO chief there, given the changing global environment and massive disruptions in international markets and also global food systems, there are expected to be many potential sort of flashpoints as trade ministers meet in Geneva. What are some of the hot topics up for discussion this year?
Well, yeah, absolutely. As you say, there are a huge amount of topics to be discussed here in Geneva. One of the most important, of course, is rebuilding from the pandemic and really trying to rebuild just to get back to where things were before the pandemic started. So that, of course, is an issue that is very much up for discussion. Another huge topic is, of course, the rising food insecurity, the spiraling prices we've seen since the Ukraine conflict began. And so these are all huge topics to which there are no easy answers, but require a huge amount of cooperation between nations. And that's what people are worried about here, whether these nations who might have very differing views on things are going to be able to put enough aside to strike some trade deals. As we've heard there, the woman in charge is very much saying that this is going to be a rocky road and basically keep your fingers crossed, but we're not entirely sure whether we're going to see any deals done. We're also expecting lots of conversations about things such as pollution and also about fishing rights as well. So a huge amount being discussed here in Geneva.
Well, one of the hot issues and maybe contentious issues is that of patent protections for COVID-19 treatments. Some say that it is a crisis that has been brewing at the WTO for years now, and that could come to a head this year. So what has been the tone of these particular discussions and, of course, the outcomes so far?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be hearing a lot of discussion about COVID-19 vaccines and intellectual property and the rights to those intellectual property. So India and South Africa, as we've been reporting for months, are very much pushing to allow to override this intellectual property, to allow poorer companies to make vaccines, to allow countries just to be able to control their own destiny when it comes to fighting things such as pandemics, and be able to really level the playing field in terms of who gets access to these vaccines and when they get access. So that is a huge topic of conversation. Of course, though, like any contentious issue, there are plenty who say that actually that's not the way to go. The US, certain US politicians, the big pharma industry as well, say that if these measures were introduced where intellectual property rights for vaccines were waived, then what you're going to see is no one privately wanting to put any money into vaccine research. And so that is going to create huge problems when it comes to finding new vaccines in future pandemics or any other issues as well. So So of course, that's being discussed. A watered down version is being discussed here, but many people say that watered down version will be too difficult to enforce and won't do enough to help. So that is another thing we're going to be keeping an eye on over the coming days.
Well, also, we saw the WTO members sign a statement in support of Ukraine. They also expressed concern about the repercussions of that conflict and its impact on global food security. Have there been any major decisions that will help ease the flow of food supplies to the most vulnerable nations and also stem hoarding in the food market?
Well, put quite simply, no, there haven't been any big decisions made yet. And there are plenty of commentators, plenty of experts, plenty of opinion pieces being written in the European press and the local press here in Geneva as well, questioning whether anything is actually going to get signed. Of course, trade deals are hugely complex, as you might imagine. We have over 100 countries, all with different aims, different ideas about what they want to achieve, and trying to find some sort of level of agreement is hugely difficult in a meeting that only really lasts for a few days, whereas these discussions will go on for years behind the scenes. So plenty of people warning that maybe not a huge amount is going to be achieved here, that maybe it's a chance for countries to do some handshaking behind the scenes to really try and work on some bigger global issues. But then of course you've got people questioning whether the World Trade Organization is fit for purpose, saying that if you, with all the challenges currently facing the world, whether that's vaccines for COVID-19 or food insecurity, which is obviously a huge topic for very many countries in Africa, people are saying if the World Trade Organization can't deal with these huge issues, is it as an organisation itself fit for purpose, or has the time come, sort of 20 plus years since it was formed, that maybe it's time just to move on, and that actually a better way to do this is for countries to try and strike their own deals rather than going through this big global organisation. So all of these are going to be things that we'll be keeping an eye on in the coming days.
Well, many thanks, John, for that great update. That, of course, is John Bever joining us there in Geneva. And let's now delve further into all these issues with Torek Farhadi, a former advisor at the IMF, World Bank and the WTO, and he joins us now in Geneva. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. Now, as we watch this global food crisis take center stage at this year's meeting, we know that wealthy nations, they're continuing to call for more free trade going forward. We're also seeing smaller producers say that will only worsen the situation going forward. Are they close to a solution? Can they find a solution that will certainly ensure that food security is there for everyone?
Well, unfortunately not, and the WTO has limitations in what it can do for food security in time of war. This is a supply crisis in food security, especially after the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and between 10 and 15% of wheat that was going to go towards Africa and the Southern Hemisphere has now difficulty leaving Ukraine. And without taking sides in the conflict, the Russians are complaining that the Black Sea has mines there, land mines inside the block of water, so ships cannot go easily and pick up the grain. And also the Ukrainians are complaining that their grain is confiscated by the Russians. But in any case, even if the Russians wanted to sell the Ukrainian grain, they are under SWIFT sanctions, which doesn't allow people to pay them easily. So as you can see here, the WTO is powerless for what goes on with the supply crisis. It is powerless for what goes on in the security crisis following this war. It is powerless in front of the SWIFT sanctions that the Western countries have put on Russia. The reality of the WTO is that it's an organization that it has lived most of its useful life. The WTO came out of the GATT General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1995. Its paramount objective was to eliminate tariffs. So for 27 years, 25 years, they worked on eliminating tariffs and signing all kinds of free trade agreements between blocks of countries. One very well known is the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. And China joined the WTO in 2001. The US allowed China to join, thinking that China, by joining, would open the market for the US. China did open the market for the US, but in the last 25 years, it became very competitive and started exporting much more to the US, which created the populist movements against globalization. And when President Trump put tariffs of 10% on the $300 million of imports coming from China in August of 2019, it really put a stab on the back of the WTO spirit of no tariffs. This is something the Americans had lobbied for since 1995, no tariffs, free trade agreements, and suddenly an American president put tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States. And then it put more tariffs on other tranches of Chinese imports. Right. And when Biden came in, people were expecting for him to lift the tariffs, but he has not lifted tariffs. So this means that there is no bipartisan enthusiasm in the United States for the WTO anymore. And if the Americans are participating in these meetings, it's just lip service.
Right. Well, we'll get further into the future of the WTO going forward, but let's just hone in on some of the issues on the table at this meeting, ones that are especially important for developing nations. For example, one of the things they need to decide is whether they're going to fully waive patent protection for COVID-19 treatments developed in the West, and of course allow these poorer nations to manufacture their own. Is that a battle you see developing nations winning anytime soon? And as you heard our correspondent, they might come up with some solution, but a watered-down version. What are your thoughts?
Exactly. During COVID, where humanity was in danger, the WTO was unable, because COVID happened in 2020, we are in 2022, 2 years on, the WTO has been unable to do anything about these patents. And now this pandemic is over almost for the larger part. And if this work needs to arrive at some conclusion for the next pandemic. But yes, there will be a watered down version, but the companies that are have created the drugs against COVID, for instance, with public funds, are not allowing the patents to go away that easily. And that has been a complaint of India as well, which is a large manufacturer of drugs in the world, but it has not been able to have access to all the patents fast enough.
Well, there are also the many contentious issues on the table, and of course we can't go through all of them in this interview today, but what are some of those other issues that you think will see significant movement on this year at the meeting?
This year, not much significant movement. There is an agreement on fisheries to stop fishing too much, basically, to abide by the climate objectives. But there also, the WTO doesn't have any enforcement teeth. The WTO is an organization which worked well in time of peace. In time of war, when countries prefer to have bilateral trade relationships, when countries use trade as a weapon of war, in the situation in Ukraine, we see that the grain export situation is a weapon of war, actually. And in that case, the WTO doesn't have any enforcement mechanism on any teeth, much like some of the other UN organizations. So the WTO has to reinvent itself, but the risk is that if it doesn't have much to do, it will copy things that other UN organizations like the UNCTAD or ITC or other UN organizations are doing. So there's a lot of duplication here. The only interest that the WTO has is that every 2 years, the trade ministers come in and gather and talk to each other, but they don't arrive at many conclusions. In the past, before all of that, there has been issues with agriculture already. That's why, aside the issue of Ukraine, we are still in a crisis of food security in the world. So this is the difficulty, is that these organizations were peacetime organizations. They have lived most of their useful lives. Nobody wants to close them, but really, if they stay open, they won't be able to help countries much. They have to reinvent themselves.
Right, and you alluded to this earlier. Some are saying that this will be a make or break week for the WTO, because if the status quo prevails, then they say they can't see much future for the WTO as a multilateral organization. What are your thoughts on the future of this organization?
Well, in end of 2019 or in 2020, I believe, one of Mr. Trump's advisors suggested that the United States should withdraw from the WTO. So really, if the anchor country withdraws, then there's not much left. And the Russians also, because of the SWIFT issues and trade restriction issues, in the Duma, in their parliament, they are not very satisfied with what the WTO can do for them. So a lot of superpowers in the world are not really excited about the WTO. They have used all the good things that could come with the WTO, and now its utility is over, its useful life is over. And in November, there are elections in the United States, and the Republicans will come back to Congress in majority, I mean. And in 2025, there might be a Republican president in the United States. And there, I think, even if the WTO stays alive and with open doors, it will be a dummy organization.
Right. Well, we'll certainly be watching. We do have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on the show. That, of course, was Mr. Torek Farhadi, a former advisor at the WTO, IMF, and the World Bank.